Humans can be morally confused, cowardly, ugly, and downright cruel when there's something that they want or when they are in distress. That's what we learned last week. And when that happens, we, because all of us do it, sacrifice some portion of the humanity, the beautiful humanity that God created in us. What we learned this week is that Jesus didn't do that. Jesus retained his humanity in all the best senses of that word, even when the pressure was on. What we want to do is we want to see how. Pressure is just part of life. It is, perhaps, the defining element of the human experience. As counselor and spiritual director Sheila Wise Rose pointed out even just this week, that pressure is past, present, and future. In other words, it comes from all that unprocessed struggle from our past. It comes from the stress of the present. It comes from anxiety about the future. And if we do not deal with that pressure appropriately, we'll start to scream like a teapot. Sometimes even literally. And if no one helps us out, if no one shows us the way to deal with that pressure, we will explode. You could say that is the definition of trauma. Trauma for ourselves and trauma for those who happen to be in the way when we blow our top. Now, one other thing I want to say about this pressure. It is not just multidimensional in terms of time, but it's multifaceted in terms of its source. We need to hear that again and again and again. So the writer of Hebrews tells us this too. Very famous text, Hebrews 4:14 through 16. The writer tells us that Jesus was tempted, or you could say tested, in every way that we are. That's why he can be so understanding towards our struggles, is because he's walked through these various tests that apply pressure to our souls. Some of these pressures are emotional. They come from unmet needs. They come from the wounds that are inflicted upon our hearts. Some of them come from actual temptations to sin. Some of them come from the hardships that are associated with walking with Christ. It took me a long time to realize that that even applies to me. I remember this was long after I was married, but I remember still struggling with this question. Does Jesus understand? Does Jesus care? I was not one who needed to live till I was 34 single. I won't get into all the reasons why, but that was not healthy for me. Okay? And one day I was praying, and again, this was long after I was married. One day I was praying, and it was as if the Spirit said, Wade, do you really think that the Lord enjoyed wandering around the Galilean countryside with 12 stinky men? He's sleeping on the side of the road when he could be in a nice warm house with a nice warm fire. I don't know, maybe cuddled up next to Mary Magdalene or some other woman who understood his virtue. Some people will be like, oh, that's heresy. No, it isn't. It would not have been sin for Jesus to marry one of these women who loved him. But it wasn't compatible with God's calling on his life. I tell you that example because I want you to understand that sometimes the pressures in our life don't have anything to do with moral excellence or moral degradation. They're just about the decisions that we have to make to walk with Jesus. So how do we deal with those pressures correctly? How do we deal with them appropriately? What is the key to faithful living? Our text shows us what that key is. You could say, in a word, it's prayer. But that's actually a little too simplistic. Okay? It is more accurately, more precisely, it is emotional honesty before God. What happens in our text here? Well, Jesus is leaving this scene we'll talk about next week, where you have him observing Passover and instituting the Lord's Supper with his disciples. And they are retreating to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is on the Mount of Olives. It's opposite Jerusalem. In fact, it's opposite the temple. You can see the temple from where Jesus was at in this garden where he was praying. He goes to this somewhat secluded place, and he leaves 8, because as we know, one of his disciples has wandered off to do something rather dastardly. We talked about that last week. So he leaves 8 of his disciples, probably somewhere close to the entrance, and he takes his closest friends, and he walks with them further into the garden to a more secluded place. And he explains to them what is going on, and then he gives them instructions, and then he wanders on by himself. He gets alone, and he prays. And he prays in a way that is truly human. You cannot doubt the humanity of Jesus as you listen to this prayer. Now remember, this what we have here is a summary, okay? Matthew is just saying, here's basically what Jesus said, all right? So you can take the various elements of this prayer and elaborate on them, right? In your mind as you're imagining it. There's a lot more going on here. But Matthew gives us the gist of it. He shows us what we really need to see. And what was Jesus' strategy for praying in the midst of this moment of existential angst? What was Jesus' strategy for addressing God in the midst of this terrible suffering? It has three elements. First of all, Jesus comes to God fully aware of all that he has already endured. Fully aware of the pressure that he is already under. Notice how honest he is with his disciples. He is overwhelmed with sorrow, and he tells them so. In fact, it's in that context that he instructs them to pray too. He wants them to keep watch over his own soul, and they do that by praying with him. And we're not going to talk much about the ways that they kind of failed here this morning. That's another sermon for another time. But we do need to understand the responsibility that Jesus gave them. He gave these three close friends the opportunity to gather around him and to be with him in the midst of this hardship, this pain. Because in truth, we cannot endure the pressures of life alone. Much less the kinds of pressures that Jesus was under. We need each other, and we need our Father in heaven. Which is why the second element of Jesus' strategy is to acknowledge before God not only the hardships that he is about to endure, but the grief that those hardships cause him. In fact, he is so honest about what is going on in his life that he actually asks the Lord, hey, God, all things are possible with you. If you've got a plan B, let's go with that. Because I don't want to do this. I think I've told you some time ago about this experience that I had when I was 16, where I really felt the Lord ask me, Wade, will you follow me wherever I lead? And I told him that I would, but my heart sank with dread because I thought I knew where he was leading. And I wish that I had realized in this moment that it's okay to say, Lord, you may have thought you could slip this past me, but I know what you're up to. And no, I don't want to do this. It's okay to say, Father, this is just too hard. I don't have the strength to do this. I don't even want to do this. I see what you're up to. I think I understand. Maybe I don't fully, but at least part of me understands why you want to lead me down the road that you're leading me down. But I don't want this. I don't want to do it this way. Natalia used to say, Lord, I got your map. I'm going to give it back to you. You need to wad that one up and throw it away. Because not only do I not want it, I don't want you giving that map to anybody else. Not only is it okay to pray that way, But there will be moments in our lives when we need to pray that way. When we see the train wreck coming, and we need to ask God, let's not do this. Please, let's do something else. Please. This is going to destroy me. I told you that Jesus very well may have been facing Jerusalem as he prayed. And you can only imagine, as pastor and New Testament scholar Rodney Reeves observes, you can only imagine that Jesus was on that mountain, in that garden, watching the mob gather. It's at night. We're told by John's Gospel that they had torches and lanterns as well as their weapons. You can only imagine that Jesus was watching all of this happen. And every time that he gets up from praying and comes back to his disciples, he can see the mob getting closer. His impending death is marching towards him. I have to say that because of the way many of us were raised in churches, we don't even get to this step in Jesus' strategy. In fact, some of us are not self-aware enough to even get to the first step. But the hardest step is yet to come. It is expressed in a simple statement. Nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. Jesus submits to the wisdom of his Father. He relinquishes control. Can you imagine that? Here he is, Son of the living God, fully divine. Yes, he's fully human as well, but fully divine. By his own words, he could call 12 legions of angels. As one worship song puts it, that's just the tip of the spear. You know? But he could call 12 legions of angels and do something completely different. Destroy the Romans, destroy everyone committed to iniquity. He could do that in a flash. And yet, what does he do? As Philippians 2 tells us, he submits himself to God. Hebrews tells us the same thing. In fact, Hebrews tells us that he learned obedience through what he suffered. Isn't that astonishing? Isn't that an astonishing statement for him to make? For the writer of Hebrews to make. And by the way, you'll see the reference that I've put on the screen for you, Hebrews 5, 7 through 10. The writer of Hebrews traces this same process that we're talking about out of Matthew's Gospel. Jesus expresses himself fully to God. He does exactly what Paul would later teach us to do about prayer. He makes his requests known to God. That's out of Philippians. But remember what Paul says. Philippians 4. Make your requests known to God. He doesn't say, and you'll get what you want. What he says is, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and your minds. How does that happen? Because when we are making our requests known to God, and when we are in the same breath saying, nevertheless, let's do what you want to do. Let's do what is your will. We are drawing near to our Father. We are drawing ourselves into His presence. We are remembering who we are. You see, that's what Jesus is doing at every step in this prayer strategy. He's acknowledging that He is not above human suffering. He is acknowledging that this is hard. He is submitting His very heart and His very soul to God. God, I don't want this. But then He continues that process of recognizing what is now His status as a human being, as one of us. And He's saying, nevertheless, not my will, but yours. Throughout this entire process, Jesus is being human in the fullest and best way. He's being authentic. And He's being submissive to God. He's not doubling down on self like the confused and the cowardly and the ugly and the cruel. He's not protecting Himself. No, He is, in Paul's words, emptying Himself. Pouring Himself out before the Lord. Is it a risk? You bet it's a risk, because it's an act of love. And as C.S. Lewis taught us, love is always risky because love involves vulnerability. You cannot love unless you are willing to be vulnerable. And if you are vulnerable, sometimes you're going to get hurt. But what Jesus understands is, yes, He may get hurt, and God may not prevent it, but God is not the one who's going to hurt him. God is the one who's going to carry him. And as Lewis reminds us, you cannot have a heart that is soft, a heart that is pliable, a heart that is human, unless you allow that heart to be vulnerable. If you wrap that heart in protective bubble, it will harden. It will become, in Lewis's words, unbreakable, irredeemable. Now, whatever we do in these instances of pressure will bear fruit in our lives. But the question is, what kind of fruit will it bear? In Jesus' life, it bore good fruit. The first of these fruit is courage. We actually saw Jesus' courage last week, but His courage saturates all of chapters 26 and 27. Courage is not a word that is used very often in the New Testament. In fact, it's surprisingly rare, and there's some important cultural and theological reasons why that's the case. And sometimes the church spent more time looking at Aristotle's virtues than it did the virtues of Jesus. Sometimes perhaps the church overemphasized courage, especially in its definition of manliness. But courage is a virtue. Courage is one of the fruit that is born from living vulnerably before God. It is one of the fruit that is born from emotional honesty in the presence of our God. Now, there's lots of courage out there. There's lots of different kinds, or at least ways of expressing courage. You can express courage when you stand up for your convictions. You can express courage when you face an evil enemy, especially when you're outnumbered and there is no assurance of victory. But one of the most interesting and perhaps one of the most profound expressions of courage is when we stand up not to our enemies, but to our friends, to the people who are supposed to be on our team. It's one thing to rebuke an outsider. It's one thing to rebuke an enemy. It's another thing entirely to correct someone who is part of your people. Because so often we just feel like that kind of correction will be poorly received, and the bonds of fellowship will be broken. But psychologist and theologian Jim Wilder argues that we cannot build healthy Christian communities without correction. There has to be people who have the courage to take us aside and lovingly and appropriately, as Jesus did with his own disciples, say, "No, you're off track here. This is not how we, the people of God, live." And that's essentially what Jesus does at his anointing. His rebuke of his disciples is pretty straightforward. But what he is reminding them is, this is not how I have taught you to live. And really that flows rather naturally into our second fruit that is born out of this honesty before God. It is integrity. Jim Wilder describes integrity as being who we really are. That is, being who God created us to be. The Christian psychiatrist Kurt Thompson describes integrity as remaining completely connected with all the various parts of ourselves and with those around us. Because, as he observes, under stress, what ends up happening is the various parts of our brain unplug from each other, and what that does is it leaves the lower right portion in charge, which happens to be the least mature part. Sometimes we are so unplugged that lizard brain takes over, and we cease to be truly human. But when we are living emotionally honestly, before God, we remain truly ourselves. Notice what Jesus does there in verses 56 through 75, or 57 through 75, I should say. He's standing before the Sanhedrin, or some portion thereof, at this preliminary hearing, and they're trying to dig up all the dirt they can, but they can't get any witnesses to agree with each other, and so they don't have any evidence that will stand up in court. And finally, the high priest stands up and says, "All right, I'm tired of this. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Now, Jesus could have nuanced his answer. He could have said, "Well, yeah, I am, but not the way you think I am." He could have continued to obscure his true identity from these people, knowing that if he tells them who he really is, they're going to try to have him killed for blasphemy. But that's not what he does. Jesus knows that it's time. He knows that it's time to be honest. And so he just tells them, yes. And he doesn't leave it there because remember what I've taught you, Son of God in the Old Testament is not a divine title. It's a kingly title. It's a title that was given to Israel's kings, particularly Judah's kings. Okay? But Jesus wants them to understand that this title has been changed, that what it communicates has been altered. And so he continues on with a reference to the imagery of Daniel 7. You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. That imagery lets them know exactly who Jesus is claiming to be. And that's when the high priest tears his robes and demands that Jesus be executed. Jesus has every opportunity to get out of it, to try something else, and he refuses to do so. It's not the only definition of integrity, but it's a really important one. Now, balancing this courage and this integrity, we see Jesus showing restraint. He doesn't lash out at his opponents. He doesn't make threats or anything like that. In fact, sometimes he just doesn't even answer the charges that are being leveled against him. It's almost like he's just decided, these people are not going to listen to me anyway. He had every right to make threats. He had every right to say, I'm going to get you. You go ahead and do this, but I'm going to get you. He doesn't. And he doesn't call down the angels from heaven to smite all the evildoers. He shows restraint. And in fact, he even goes so far as to show mercy. We talked about this last week. Here his disciples are. They can't even stay awake long enough to pray for him. When he finally gets arrested, one of them cuts off somebody's ear, and then they all flee. And then Peter denies him. I mean, these guys have failed at every turn. And yet, remember what I told you last week. What does Jesus do the first time he sees them? He puts his arms around them. Not literally, so to speak, but figuratively. And he may have done it literally. We just don't have that in the text. He puts his arms around them, draws them to himself, spends some time with them, talks with them, and then he commissions them, even though he knows good and well that some of them still have doubts. You ever had doubts? I have. And I'll just tell you, I need God's mercy in those moments. I live in constant fear that he's going to just, smash me to bits with a giant sledgehammer. Remember, Jesus is not Thor. That's not how he works. But sometimes I feel that way. I feel the weight of that judgment. But what Jesus is showing us by his actions is mercy. And mercy only arises out of a deep and abiding acquaintance with God. Jim Wilder regularly says that our response when somebody's acting a fool, Natalia likes to describe it as showing their rear, is not to react in anger against them. It's to realize, they're not plugged into Jesus right now. They are not feeling the presence of their Creator. I need to help them get plugged back into Christ. Now I quote Dr. Wilder because I'm not very good at that yet. But that's the direction we're moving. We're moving that direction where we are so plugged into Christ that A, we're not the ones out there showing our rear, as Natalia likes to put it. And B, when other people are, we're able to help them in a way that will actually help them. Mercy. It is an amazing thing. Now, in conclusion, let's remember, Jesus is the Son of God. And yet, He lives a fully human life as a fully human person. Indeed, He faced struggles, sorrows, temptations that few of us can even imagine. Remember chapter 4. In the midst of the pressure that Jesus faced, He could have done what so many of us do. He could have given in to the lies that evil tells and just forgotten about His love for His Father or His mission to save us. He could have just looked out for Himself. That's not what He did. Jesus didn't ignore the pressure that He was under. That's not what any of this is about. If that's what you take from this morning's message, then I have failed. Jesus does not ignore the hardships. He speaks honestly with His Father about them. He prays, and He prays, and He prays. That's what He does. And that's how He finds the strength to carry on. That's how He finds the resources to live as an authentic person. A person that honors God. A person that is faithful to God's will and to His own character. That's the example that Jesus sets for us. It is not about willpower. It is not about simply deciding, well, I'm going to be a moral superstar, or I'm not going to crack under the pressure, or, I'm just going to ignore all the hardships of life and I'm just going to keep on trucking. I'm just going to keep on soldiering. You know what? Most people can't do that. And the ones who can become calcified. They become hardened. They either break up themselves or they break other people. That's not what Jesus does. No. Every time the pressure gets turned up, Jesus comes to His Father. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Every time we sin, come to God. Every time that we're tempted, come to God. Every time that we're wounded, come to God. Every time we're anxious, worried, frustrated, lonely, broken, come to our Father. That's what I hope that we'll do as individuals, and that's what I hope that we will do as a church. Let us pray.